Now at Lowe's, faster quotes start at the Lowe's Pro Desk. Got a material list handwritten on a sticky note or saved as a photo? Perfect. Bring it to us and get a quote in minutes. And if you don't see what you need on the shelf, we'll help you get it. You can access thousands of products beyond what's available in-store or on Lowes.com, right from the Lowe's Pro Desk. Build quotes faster and source the materials you need to keep your jobs moving. Just like that, at Lowe's.
This is Peter.
And this is Tom.
And you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcast.
Now part of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to our podcast. What do we got today, Tommy?
Well, today we're looking at something has a lot of different layers, let's say. It's like Shrek said, it's like an onion and like an ogre. There's a lot of layers with this. We're going to be looking at the history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Some people see them as heroes, some people saw them as oppressors. So we're just going to kind of look into the backstory of it, how they came to be, and what they are today.
I did not think that you were going to somehow work in Shrek into Pinkerton Detective Agency.
It's all about connections, Pete. That's what teaching is, right? It's all about drawing the connections, having the hooks, getting the kids involved.
Yeah.
You know, end of the year doesn't mean we have to stop it.
Pinkertons, guys. Just for those of you guys that we're obviously going to go into who the Pinkertons were, but
Sure.
Pinkertons were basically private eyes. They were a hired police force that at some point or another in the United States, it actually became the federal police force because it was hired, and we'll get into that, by the federal government. And eventually, as Tom got into it a little bit, it does kind of tarnish its own reputation, and then you might think it disappears. However, doing this research, Tom and I just talked about this before we click record, the Pinkertons are actually still around. You could still hire the Pinkerton Agency, Detective Agency. This is still a real deal. And, you know, they're known for many different reasons. But, for example, the idea or the terminology of the private eye is actually inspired by the Pinkertons. It comes from the Pinkertons. So their logo is this large, unblinking eye because their slogan was, "We never sleep." That gave rise to the term of private eye as a nickname for detectives, particularly Pinkerton detectives in like 1850s. So therefore, the term private eye that we use today for private detectives stems from these guys.
That's where it comes from. Yeah, it all goes back to the Pinkerton. Like you said, they're still around today. They deal with, they manage business risks and security concerns really all over the world. Their success really goes all the way back to like the beginning, which is what where we'll start.
Let's start with Alan Pinkerton. Yep, 1842.
He comes to Chicago, right? Yeah. All right. So he ran basically a business that he basically made barrels. That's what he was basically starting out with, that for shipping. And then a few years after he started, he uncovered a bunch of counterfeiters while he was out, just kind of walking around trying to find lumber for his barrels. And he saw this. Instead of like walking away and hoping not to get caught, he started performing surveillance on this group and actually helped the police make the arrest on them. And he kind of saw there was like a need for this. He became kind of like a local hero because of this. And then they started just calling him all the time for detective work. Can you surveil this person, follow these people around? So he kind of became like the sheriff, and he went to work for the U.S. Post Office and became a police detective on the Chicago police force all within a couple of years. And then he just realized, I can have a private police force, which is legal. Like not police force, but a private detective agency is legal. You can't have your own private police force, but you can have your own private security or your own detective agency. And by 1950, he opens up his own private company known as the Pinkerton Detective Agency that would evolve into what history knows them as.
Yep. By the way, he immigrated from Scotland, for those of you that did not know that. When he creates this company, he actually does this in 1850s. And he meets a Chicago attorney named Edward Rucker. And the two men together formed this Northwestern Police Agency, which eventually becomes known as the Pinkerton Agency. But their main thing is they were spies. They kind of use these espionage skills to attract different clients. And they said, look, like, if you want us to spy on something, if you need us to find out information, we are detectives, we could do this. And initially just starts really with Alan Pinkerton and maybe a couple of his agents before it really grows. And kind of, at one point, it actually outgrows the U.S. Army. I think I just read that somewhere, that it had more men than the United States Armed Forces, which I think is...
He's really famous in that Chicago area, right? But I'm going to fast forward a bit. What really made him famous all over like the country was in 1861, the Pinkertons foil a plot to assassinate the President-elect Abraham Lincoln.
Yep.
And when that happens, Lincoln then establishes them as like a secret service, and that kind of catapults them in the agency into national spotlight. And from then on, they're given a lot of like really important jobs, like safety jobs. They had to ensure the safety delivery of the manuscript of the Gettysburg Address. They were put in charge of major U.S. cities and stuff like that. And we know that on we'll get into some of their things that they did that people aren't crazy about, like breaking up a lot of labor unions and stuff like
Yeah,
that, or a lot of
that's like
these
the
labor things.
later stages. Yep.
That's like the later stages, but they really start to become famous after stopping this first assassination attempt on Lincoln. Not so much later on, but they get the one in 1861.
Yep. So in 1861, well, the story here goes that the detectives were investigating something else. The Pinkertons were investigating rumors of some Southern sympathizers that were trying to sabotage rail lines to Washington, D.C. So they sent a couple undercover agents to gather some intelligence. And what these undercover agents figured out, and they didn't really find the Southern sympathizers that were trying to sabotage the rail lines, but they did find that, or uncover rather, a plot to assassinate Lincoln, who, as you said, was on his whistle stop tour at the time, right? Supposedly, this was supposed to happen as he switched his trains in Baltimore for his final trip to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So what the Pinkertons did is they actually tracked down President. This is at a time where there's no Secret Service, right?
But they heard about this. They track him down, let him know. Yeah.
Literally, like they inform him, like, look, there's a plot against you, blah, blah, blah. And one of their most famous agents, who was a woman, Kate Warren, I'm sure you saw that. He was
First
also
female detective. Yeah, right.
first female detective in the United States, and several other agents. They basically arranged for Lincoln to board an overnight train in Baltimore hours before the actual published schedule. So they basically have put him on a separate, like, regular person train. But to do that and to kind of foil the conspirators, they do a few things. One, they wound up cutting old telegraph lines around the train station so that way the conspirators cannot communicate with one another, just in case. But then Agent Warren has Lincoln pose as her, like, invalid brother, and they kind of dress him up, and she's like helping him out to cover up his identity. And this is the guy that was just elected president.
Like the president, just showing how crazy the time was.
Yeah, and he
Like
arrives
the
in
turmoil.
Washington. Yeah, a lot of people don't notice he arrives in Washington as the president of the United States, basically like dressed as this, like, an undercover.
And undercover, yeah, in
news.
disguise.
Yeah.
Disguise, because that's how crazy things were. And there is some, the press kind of then gets wind of this, and all of them call him a coward, like, because you weren't born things when you're sneaking into the White House. How does that make you look? And there is some historians that believe that this might have been exaggerated by the Pinkertons to kind of help them get. But, the evidence, they do believe something was afoot. They never caught anybody. But there were a lot of people definitely during that time that were going after Lincoln.
That's a fact. But I also think that this is what gave them the credibility, because now you have a guy that just became president, and now you're in his good graces. So they're like,
you're going to get federal funds regardless. You're getting money now. Like you're going to become, you're part of the big time. And he does. They spy a lot for the Union Army during the Civil War. They do a lot of stuff with the Confederacy. They get information from them. So they're doing all this stuff. They're being helpful. That's kind of like this, like, special service almost. Literally.
Yeah, mentioned this idea in the Civil War. First of all, they had agents spread across the entire nation to really seek out Southern sympathizers throughout the war. They also teamed up with General George B. McClellan, and the Pinkertons formed a special intelligence force that actually worked for the U.S. Army and was paid with federal funds to try to stifle different attacks, sabotage attacks. But also, a lot of times, they would go behind enemy lines and keep an eye on different, like, Southern movements that they would then. It was basically like think of it as like a espionage group that was working for the federal government. There was also a whole another special investigative unit of the Pinkertons that was assigned to conduct interviews with escaped slaves and try to formulate different information to understand the Confederacy movements and so on and so forth. There's one particular moment that was kind of not the shining moment. I'm sure you read this, that one of their pieces of information was actually slightly exaggerated, and actually not slightly. The one thing that was happening is McClellan believed them up to this point because all the information was correct that he was getting. So in the 1862 Peninsula Campaign, the Pinkerton agents reported that Confederate forces that were around Richmond were actually twice their actual size. So McClellan did not attack because he believed this faulty intel, and he's like, oh, you know what? The rebels are definitely outnumbering me, but they weren't. That was because the Pinkerton had kind of screwed up.
Yeah, well, McClellan was a very cautious general too. He wasn't getting along with Lincoln. I know we talked about that in our Lincoln, Civil War podcasts. Talking about that, like Lincoln. That's one of the reasons why Lincoln fired him.
Yeah, no, that's a whole other thing. They really started making their money in mid 1850s. Kind of like what brought them to Lincoln's attention in the first place is because they made a lot of deals with businessmen, which eventually comes back to bite them in the butt because they wind up go into all these different businesses and big businesses in 1850s, which most would dealt with railroads at the time. And these businesses this time wanted greater control over their employees. These are early beginnings of unionization, I guess, or unions. This comes to fruition more in 1870s, but in 1850s, the Pinkertons start really making their name for themselves and making most of their money by working for big companies and really working as private detective systems, but
And
also
private
as
police force, security
yeah,
police force.
yeah, security on railroads. They would literally they would ride railroads to try to protect them from any form of people trying to them and rob them. They
Yeah,
were
attack robberies. Yeah, they were
they were
riding
basically
shotgun, literally. Yeah,
literally, really, it was like a police force for hire. Once the Civil War ends, you saw this, right? In 1871, Congress basically contracts them. The Department of Justice is created, this new Department of Justice, and it is devoted to the detection and prosecution of those guilty of violating federal law. But there was no police force to actually
so you do this. Yeah,
detect and prosecute to do this. And the money that Congress allocated, which was $50,000, so it's equivalent to a little over $1 million in today's money, was not actually sufficient to create its own investigating unit. So like what we know as FBI today, Federal Bureau of Investigation, it wasn't enough money when this was created. So they're like, all right, well, we have this new Department of Justice. We have about $50,000. Best we could do is hire the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. And that's what they do.
it was a huge gain for them, but they were still struggling like financially by this point. They weren't making that. They were basically so large, they weren't making enough money to really keep things going. Kind of like another event that happens that we've talked about in the past, right? Go back in archive. In 1871, you have the Great Chicago Fire, and their main office was actually destroyed during this. A lot of their records and stuff was destroyed. And Pinkerton claims that the loss of the offices cost them at least $250,000 in 1872 money. So they were forced to take loans from his employees and mortgage a lot of personal property just to keep things surviving. You had the Panic of 1873. So they were losing a lot of money at this point, and that's why they're going to take some jobs that maybe they wouldn't have taken otherwise and be a little bit more aggressive than they would have been, right, in order to kind of secure these funds to keep the business going.
Exactly. You would say that I guess their peak would be 1870s, 1880s. But what winds up happening during this peak, so the government basically uses the Pinkertons to break down strikes. And they do so well. They do this so well that then
a lot of it's violent too.
Well, with violence, that's what I mean. Yeah, obviously.
When you have guns, you can do that. Yeah, you can. They're not negotiating these things down. They're going with force.
Yep. But initially, this is the irony in this, the government sends them in to help corporations. But by 1880s, the corporations start to hire Pinkertons directly to be strike breakers, to escort strike breakers. So while initially it's the government that kind of sets them up for this, like, okay, government's going to bring in local militia and the government's going to bring in the army to try to control violent strikes. But when they say militia, they really bring in their Department of Justice, organization, which is the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. And what essentially starts to happen is the Pinkertons are getting so out of hand with the violence towards these union strikes. I mean,
they come in, they're beating people, they're just destroying
they're shooting people.
Basically, their makeshift protest villages, what you want to call them, big thing like a Hooverville from the 1930s. Well, yeah, they're shooting people. All right, they're beating people to death. So they're breaking these strikes up, but they're doing it with violence, particularly like the coal miner strikes and stuff like that.
The biggest one of them all was the Homestead strike, right? In July 6, 1892, 300 Pinkerton agents were sent in from the New York and Chicago offices, and they were called in this time not by the government, but by Carnegie Steel Company. So this is, if you want to go back and listen to our podcast. And this results in basically a firefight. 60 men are killed, 23 are wounded. The confrontation becomes so violent, it is dubbed the Battle of Homestead. And the governor of Pennsylvania actually has to mobilize the state law enforcement, like the National Guard, to try to break down the fight between the Union strikers and the Pinkertons. And the Pinkertons, obviously, there was less of them, so they eventually lose this Battle of Homestead strike. But before they lose, they inflict enough damage to the extent that Americans start to be kind of outraged at the conduct of these Pinkertons. And they're like, wow, like, how can you treat people like that? These people are trying to fight for better hours and better wages, and you're like literally hitting them or shooting at them. And this really tarnishes the Pinkertons' involvement to the extent that in 1893, Congress actually takes action against the Pinkertons and passes the Anti-Pinkerton Act. basically curtails the relationship between federal government and private investigators or mercenaries. And if you look at the Anti-Pinkerton Act, it basically says that U.S. Congress forbids the federal government to hire out private investigators or mercenaries unless it's like absolutely necessary, meaning they can't do anything
times
by
of
themselves.
war or something like that. Yeah. Well, you
Yep.
saw that there were certain states too that was fearing that the Pinkertons were getting so large and so powerful. They outlawed them in the state because they're like mercenaries basically, and they can just take over.
Well, yeah, I
So
mean, think of like I alluded to this before, but after Alan Pinkerton died in 1884, the control of his agency fell to his two sons, Robert and William, and the company grew so much under the two sons' watch that by 1890s, it had 2,000 detectives and 30,000 reserves, like
yeah,
part-time detectives. That
that's a
was more than
huge.
yeah, that was literally more than the standing army of the United States at that time, which is why eventually said Ohio outlawed Pinkertons altogether. Pennsylvania winds up outlawing them, and slowly but surely you have the federal government that steps in and is in 1893, and it's like, okay, this is literally a private army. Like we can't let this stay like that.
But one thing they do, the FBI kind of copies, is they create one of the world's earliest criminal databases. Right? They
Yes.
call it their rogues gallery. Right? It's a collection of mugshots and like histories. They use to research and keep track of these wanted men. So think of like those wanted posters, right? With like the picture and like the information or whatever. You watch Law and Order, you see these mugshots and talk about it. These databases, when they run them through the system. They weren't doing fingerprints yet. That comes later on. But they were collecting,
Pictures,
talking about
right?
like if pictures, if they had any distinguishing marks or scars, any known associates, right? You know, the areas of expertise. This guy's a locksmith. This guy's good with weapons and stuff like that. And they started keeping this really sophisticated criminal library. All right, and the FBI winds up doing this too, but not till much later on. But the Pinkertons are the first one to do this.
Yep. Also, kind of going with what creates even more negative publicity for them. They started going after outlaws. Did you see that one? Jesse James,
Yeah,
particularly.
particularly, yeah.
Right, Reno Gang, the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid. They were hired to track these Western outlaws. There was one particular event where they wind up like blowing up Jesse James' mother's arm or something. Did you see that one? I
Yeah,
read
what
that
basically
somewhere.
happened is they were going after the Jesse James and Frank James for a while. And then one of their agents actually went undercover, tried to infiltrate their game and got caught and was killed. And the two
Hmm.
other of their detectives were killed in a shootout. So it became very personal. And then 1875, they launched a raid on James' brother's mother's house, right, in Missouri. Jesse James wasn't there. They were tipped off, but the Pinkertons got into an argument with their mother. And then during the standoff, a member of the detective tossed like a bomb through the window, blowing part of her arm off and killing James' 8-year-old half brother.
Yep.
And when this news got out, you know, this really turned a lot of, you combine this, everything else that was going on, this kind of turned a lot of public opinion against the Pinkertons for a while. And then Alan Pinkerton, he didn't want to, but he reluctantly called off the war against the James game and stuff like that because it was too much negative
Negative
publicity. And
publicity, yeah.
James winds up getting killed 7 years later in 1882. We talked about that. Didn't we do a podcast on Jesse James?
I don't know if, no,
I
we
think
did
we
the Real
did.
Wild West. We did the Real
Yeah, I
Wild
think
West.
we were Wild West and he was there. So again, check the archives. You know, cheap plug. Right?
You
Go
know, it's
back.
funny because like
Look what we have.
you and I talk about this all the time. We forget. We're like, oh, dude, let's do this one, and then we're like,
We have to,
wait,
we have to
we
make
did
like a
this one.
checklist or something like that. Yeah, we're not very well organized.
No, not as much as we should be. But
Yeah.
but especially since we like come up with these awesome ideas, and then we realize we did that like 3 years ago, and we're like, I think we did that one already. Good ideas, indeed. So the Pinkertons are kind of getting a bad name. The government, not only does the government disassociate itself with them, it literally outlaws them. I mean, it's like it doesn't outlaw them as a business,
Well, yeah,
but
because they were so good at the. Think about it, you're so good at your job, whether or not obviously they're being violent and stuff, but you're so good at what you do. You're growing so large. The government says, "All right, you can't really. We don't want really doing what you're doing anymore because you're too good at it." Like they bring in their own agencies like the FBI and stuff to come in and start doing stuff. They're not going to outsource to this private agency anymore. The government wants to take it over themselves.
nuts. All right, so let's talk about the modern era of what winds up happening to the Pinkertons and where they are today. Obviously, by this time, by late 1800s, early 1900s, they're very much tarnished. They're kind of viewed as bullied, as a mercenary force,
Oh, but I
really.
thought, yeah.
Particularly, they are associated with strike breaking. That's ultimately what. But also, we're looking at a progressive era. We're looking at labor is having somewhat better relations with their
Yeah.
employers. So there really isn't that much
Well, you're
room
having
for
that
them.
sort of conflict with labor unions are getting a little bit better, and their name kind of becomes synonymous with like labor organizations and with strike breaking, right? But what's also starting to go on is you have this police modernization movement, right? And during this time,
Yep.
it's a progressive era. So the police are becoming more better trained. The idea of kind of community policing is starting to take hold a little bit more. You're seeing the rise of the FBI that we talked about before, and a lot of these other resources. They don't need the public ones as much. So they're still thriving during this time. They're still doing very well, but they were getting more involved in protection services than detective. And then by the 1960s, the word detective even disappeared from their letterhead. They got rid of that. Now they were becoming more of this protection type of firm that were going to like help escort people or movie stars or assets, things of that nature.
Yep. You do mention this modernization movement and police force and actual progressive movement. You have on a local level, a local police force is being created, and money is allocated for local police forces, and also money is being allocated to state police forces. And then you have the birth of the early FBI. And initially, it was Bureau of Investigation. It was BOI, or BI for short, before it was changed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935. But all that, the federal government is starting to get away from detective agencies, and that stems from, in the United States Senate, you have the La Follette Committee that basically looks into subcommittee that investigates violations of rights, free speech, labor, so on and so forth. And this is happening in 1930s. And between 1936 and 41, this La Follette Civil Liberties Subcommittee publishes these extensive hearings and reports on just industrial espionage and private police agencies.
Yeah. And that's what they
And
start to get involved with. Yeah.
exactly. And they basically start looking at the 5 largest detective agencies, because Pinkerton is by far the largest national detective agency. But then you had William J. Burns International Detective Agency. There's a few other ones. And they basically go after these agencies so much that a lot of these are subpoenaed. The Pinkerton Agency actually winds up destroying most of their records because they want to get rid of evidence. However, there's still enough evidence to show that the Pinkerton Agency actually had operatives in every single union in the country. Biggest union, United Mine Workers, United Rubber Workers, name a union in the United States at a time, the Pinkerton Agency had spies within that union.
That's something that they still doing today. Like there's evidence in 2020 they were hired by Amazon, right, to spy
Yep.
on warehouse workers that were signs of union activity. And in 2022 they were hired by Starbucks. Former being forward was actually hired by Starbucks to work on union
To
busting. So
infiltrate,
they're
yeah, to infiltrate. Yep.
infiltrating through this union bust. So they're still doing this sorts of things. And I saw this one case that's probably interesting in 2023. Like right now, it's the
The
Wizard of the
cards, right?
Coast. Not Pokemon cards, but Magic cards. They actually, the Wizards of the Coast, which are people who like created Magic the Gathering, actually hired Pinkerton detectives to seize products
This
from
was
the
like months
March of the
ago,
Machine.
literally months ago.
From the March of the Machine Aftermath card set, which comes from Magic the Gathering from a YouTuber. This YouTuber purchased them from a local game store, but they got them before they were supposed to come out, and he started showing these cards on YouTube before they were supposed to be released, which I guess is a big deal. Well, obviously licensing and stuff like that is a big deal.
Yeah.
So the Pinkertons they intimidated, threatened this guy, threatened to throw him in jail to the compliance to basically say, you're not showing these cards anymore. And then when this story got out, a lot of the Wizard of the Coast said, listen, we tried to contact this guy. He refused to even talk to us. So we needed to do something. This is our product. It's not supposed to come out for this certain date. He's releasing it early. That's not part of our agreement. So he can't do that. So we had to hire somebody. That's what they do now. Like they're still doing these sorts of things. They focus on threat intelligence, risk management, protection, and actually active shooter response. They'll come in to companies and give seminars and just and training on how to deal with active shooters. It's
Yeah.
intense stuff.
Sometimes they're hired to cover different like rival right and left wing protests. I don't know if you saw that. Same
Yeah,
thing to kind
both
of
sides. Yeah.
like infiltrate them and to see who's
Oh,
instigating what.
they're still thriving. Like this is not something that went away. It's just probably like they're not as known. Maybe like I guess history people know Pinkertons, but people still think Pinkertons. They think of the labor movements, right? Like we said, the union busting and stuff like that. But they are still a major force in the United States, a major company, entity, whatever you want to call it. They're still doing their thing.
Which I think is crazy. They were actually the main force that guarded the coffin of Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah. So
Um, at her funeral in Westwood Memorial Park. They were dressed in like almost like cop uniforms, but it was like a Pinkerton Detective Agency in the 60s. But just the sheer fact that literally they were in the news a few months ago, and that, trying to find some YouTubers.
Yeah. We're like dealing with like the swords of the blue-eyed dragon of the South Mountains or something like that. That's what couldn't be released, but stuff like that. But but they're still hiring too. You can go to the Pinkerton Careers current openings. They are
there anything?
They are hiring. Yeah, they are an equal opportunity employer. So you can definitely go and they probably have a lot of different job callings.
Oh, honestly, I just looked it up. Agent, unarmed and armed, full-time Pinkerton.
There you go. Summer job, Pete.
And for those of you that are curious, by the way, you need a high school diploma or a GED with law enforcement, military, or security experience. If you're an unarmed Pinkerton agent today, you get $25 an hour. And if you're an armed agent, which means I guess you could die because everywhere you go, you bring the gun with you, right? You're $30 an hour.
They are all over not only the United States, but the world too. They have offices in India, China, Canada. Like they are doing threat assessment.
But yeah, so Pinkertons are not just Alan Pinkerton. It's not just about Jesse James and getting on, railroads and trying to get bad guys and eventually breaking up strikes. This is still, to this day, the Pinkerton Detective Agency does exist. So yeah, that's that. I'm pretty sure, I think we covered everything there's to cover about the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Well, thank you so much, guys, for tuning in once more. We do appreciate it. If you need to find us, you can find us at www.historyteacherstalkingpodcast.com. Please feel free to follow us on social media. We are pretty much everywhere you look, you will find us. And make sure you click that subscribe and like button wherever you do listen to us. So thank you so much, and we'll see you guys next week.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.